Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar on Project Hercules. Many of you will have heard me mention this over the last 2 or 3 years, and many of you will have participated in our online surveys or even attended a Project Hercules meeting. And so today we wanted to share with you the outcomes of the work and explain why Hercules was so desperately needed, and how important your contributions have been and will continue to be for the project. So we brought together the Project Hercules team, myself, Josie and Fleur, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Just use the Q&A toolbar at the top of the Zoom, or we'll take some live questions at the end of our presentations. So I'm Emily Crossley. Many of you know me. I set up Duchenne UK with the wonderful Alex Johnson after both our sons, Eli and Jack, were diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And we started off with a very clear mission, really, to fund and accelerate research. We've spent more than £15 million in the last 7 years. We've helped to seed fund gene therapy, which is now in the clinic. We're funding a clinical trial looking at tamoxifen with other charities in Europe. We've lobbied very hard to help patients get access to medicine as soon as possible through the Early Access to Medicine scheme. And we also we've invested over £2 million funding doctors, nurses and physiotherapists in the NHS to deliver clinical trials for patients in this country. I just wanted to give you that overview because I think when Alex and I both started out, we really just wanted to focus on getting those treatments into the clinic and being given to patients as soon as possible. And when somebody said to us, well, you know, it's all very well, but if these drugs get approved, you're going to struggle to get health systems to pay for them. And I couldn't believe this. My son's got Duchenne. How could they not want to pay for drugs that might help the condition? But unfortunately, there was a sobering story that made us realise that actually this was going to be part of the fight. And many of you do know this story, but just bear with me while I put it into context, because this really was what inspired Project Hercules, this journey and this story. So Translarna, which is a drug that treats nonsense mutations, was given conditional marketing authorization by the European Medicines Agency in July 2014. And the labelling on the drug is important because it said that you could take the drug if you were 5 years old and until you lost ambulation. So in other words, from 5 years old, as long as you were walking, and when you stopped walking, you would not be able to access the drug anymore. So we had parents in the UK who were celebrating in July 2014, thinking that their sons had finally been given a treatment, only to see them stop walking in the time that it took for NICE, the body that assesses new medicines for value, agreed to make a decision to pay for it. So in those 2.5 years, boys who were eligible for Translarna stopped walking and became ineligible. And I realised in that moment that there's actually something far worse than having no approved treatment for your disease. And that's having a treatment that's been approved for use, that's safe and effective, but it's sitting on a shelf and you can't access it because no one has worked out how to pay for it. And this seemed to me to be an intolerable situation. And I remember going to a meeting with Alex a few years ago at the FDA, and one of the panelists there said to me, don't bring me a room full of crying mothers, bring me data. And we had actually found ourselves standing outside number 10 Downing Street with our placards campaigning for Translarna, but that seemed to me to be a frustrating way of going about it because we were talking in a language that they didn't understand, the regulators didn't understand, they couldn't hear us anyway, and we weren't really reflecting the trauma and the devastation that Duchenne wreaks on our sons and our children and on families, and somehow we needed to be a bit more sophisticated about that. So I think drug development, we all know, is extremely challenging. And the way I look at it is that there are basically two mountains that drug companies have to climb. The first one is to gather the evidence to prove that their drugs are safe and effective. And that's why they run clinical trials. They have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. They run those trials to prove that their drugs are safe and effective. But then there's what's known in the industry as the fourth hurdle. And this is another whole mountain that companies need to climb. And for this mountain, you need to prove that your drugs offer value for money. And this requires a whole new set of evidence to prove that what your drug is doing is meaningful for patients and that health systems should pay for it. And that's really what Hercules was about. It was about trying to collect the evidence that bodies like NICE and NHS England and other HTA, health technology assessment bodies around the world, would need in order to make a decision about whether to pay for or reimburse a drug. So I was incredibly fortunate to meet Fleur Chandler, a fellow mother of a son with Duchenne, Don, and the way she describes herself is having the heart of a Duchenne mum, but the head of a health technology assessment assessor, because she at the time was head of health value outcomes at GlaxoSmithKline. She watched this whole Translarna story unfold, and she picked up the phone to Alex and I one day and said, look, you know, it's incredibly frustrating because I'm sitting here watching as a parent, but also with my HTA hat on, and I'm seeing the gaps here. I'm seeing that there could be something we could do in the future to make sure that these delays don't last for so long. It doesn't take so long for a company to persuade these bodies that their drugs are offer value. So Fleur and I held a couple of meetings, and then we brought in Josie, which was another brilliant move, because Josie actually set up the highly specialised technologies appraisal system at NICE. That was the system by which rare disease drugs are appraised. And she subsequently left to set up her own agency. And Josie has been instrumental in delivering the key strategic goals of Project Hercules, and has done a fantastic job of pulling our many, many partners in together with us. So I'm going to hand over to Josie now to talk about more of the detail of Project Hercules, and then Fleur will pick up after that.
Apologies, hopefully you can hear me now. Thanks, Emily. So yeah, so I was absolutely delighted to be asked to help run Project Hercules, having sat in NICE, frustrated by many of the same things I think Emily and Fleur were frustrated by. It seemed like a fantastic opportunity to really try and work differently. And so Project Hercules is very much a global collaboration, very international, working together to build that evidence base for Duchenne that is required by health technology assessment bodies. And I'm going to expand on that a little. And then to generate, align and allow for more transparent and consistent decisions, and also we hope quicker decisions. I have the link here. So why do we need Project Hercules? Well, we have regulators, and you may think about a drug, and Emily's referred to the FDA, where regulators didn't want to hear from a room full of crying mothers. Well, in Europe to date, we've had the EMA. It'll be interesting to see what changes come next year. Can you, sorry, I think I had animations in there. But they're really looking at what's safe, does the treatment work, and is it consistently high quality? Whereas payers, in this case, we can think about NHS England or Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and health technology assessment agencies like NICE, like the Scottish Medicines Consortium, are really interested in how effective, so not just does it work, but how well does it work? And is it good value for money? And also more recently, is it affordable? So what's the budget impact? And you need quite a lot of things to understand what goes into those decisions. NICE looks at the impact of a new treatment on something called quality of life or health-related quality of life. And that's a very technical way of looking at the benefit of a new treatment. And essentially it's asking how many quality adjusted life years will a new treatment provide over and above existing treatment options. One quality of life year is effectively 1 year of perfect health. So just to be clear, nobody really has 1 year of perfect health. Even if you feel really fit and healthy, you will doubtless have a flu or colds or headaches or back pain. So most people are not going to have 1 year of perfect health. It's just a way of measuring, a unit of measuring. And then NICE is asking how much do these additional qualities, so for every extra year across the whole population that will get this treatment, how much would it cost to get us one quality? What's 1 year of perfect health worth? What's the total number of qualities going to cost us? And that's then translated into something called a incremental cost effectiveness ratio. And it's really saying, compared to what the NHS spends now, what more do we have to spend in order to get one quality? And if it is within the thresholds that NICE uses, then a product is likely to be routinely available widely across the NHS. And if it's not, it's very unlikely that that will happen. More recently, NICE and NHS England in particular have been very interested in overall budget impact. and there are new budget impact tests. So even if it's cost effective, value for money now, there may be some kind of staggering or further negotiation if it's seen to have a particularly high budget impact of £20 million or more in any 1 year. Now, the next slide. So that's the questions that NICE are asking. And in order to answer those, they ask quite a lot of companies, but also of other stakeholders. So they need to understand current treatment pathways, they need systematic reviews of the evidence around other treatments, around the treatment itself. They need to understand resource use data, so what's the burden of disease? And they need evidence to fill in any gaps of understanding, and all of that comes together in an economic model. And there's actually an awful lot of data and evidence that NICE and other agencies demand from companies, demand from stakeholders. And actually with Duchenne, we found that companies can try and do it by themselves, and as PTC had to, but it makes a lot of sense to come together and to work together, which is what Project HERCULES is aiming to do. So we've brought together various stakeholders to work collaboratively on disease level. So rather than one company building a model and all the evidence for one product, we've brought up as many people as we could together to build bottom up a disease level economic model that can be adapted for different treatment options, and Fleur will touch on that shortly. And to feed into that a burden of illness study, a bespoke quality of life metric, and data analysis, so a refined natural history model. And Fleur's going to talk you through each of those 4 key outputs from Project HERCULES, what the situation was before, and what we've done and where we've ended up. Can I have the next slide? So I just want to talk a little bit about how we've worked. The 3 of us, Fleur, Emily and myself, have very much been the core project team, but working with a much larger steering group. I think some of the members of the steering group are on the call now. And that is bringing together clinicians, bringing together patients, patient representatives, pharmaceutical companies, universities, HTA agencies such as NICE, and a number of other experts, all coming together, very generously bringing their time and their expertise to support the work. Unfortunately, we've had a number of fantastic vendors and supporters who've run each of the individual work streams, and we've been able to do it in a very iterative approach. It's been a real benefit, so that our economic model team have been able to talk very much to the quality of life team, the burden of illness team, the natural history team, and that's made a real difference in ensuring that the outputs of every single work stream are all building towards what we need for agencies like NICE. We've also, some of you will have seen things that we've done before. You may have seen posters and various Facebook and LinkedIn posts from Emily and the Duchenne UK team. It's been really important that we have that publications, that awareness, that stakeholder engagement, because ultimately these things need to be used. If they're not used, then we haven't really done our job. I just want to show you now, before handing over to Fleur, who we've been working with. This is our industry sponsors, so the partners from companies. You can see we have quite a few, and we're hoping that more will be joining us this year. So it's been fairly well received from industry, but we've also been working, as I say, with universities, with other patient organisations. I'm not sure if any of them are on the line, but we're really appreciative of PPMD in the US, who've made a big difference in our ability to actually get data and carry out the project. And others who I'm not going to try and mention everyone now, so please don't be offended if you're on the line and I don't thank you. But Fleur, would you like to take us through each of the work streams?
Yes, thank you, Josie, and thank you, Emily. And Emily introduced me as previously working at GSK. Just for transparency, I now hold the role of Head of Market Access at Sanofi. It's still, my whole career has been around health technology assessments, health economics. So a lot of this is all stuff that I do on a day-to-day basis, and it's been a real privilege to be able to bring all that knowledge into Duchenne. As Emily said, I have a son with Duchenne, so I know what it's like, but I also know what the payers would want to see. So largely in the UK, as Josie's already alluded to, you submit to a body like NICE, and I'll use NICE as our reference case here because we're in the UK and that makes sense, and they're fairly typical of an HTA body. And what a company needs to do when their drug goes into this process is write a submission that contains all of the information in terms of clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, budget impact, all of those things. But the core of this is the economic model. Now, what NICE and bodies like NICE are looking for, are saying, so what difference is this intervention making? So what the economic model does is predicts out what would happen without the intervention. And you can think of it like a set of scales, like everything that, all of the costs. So that could be hospitalizations, it could be drug costs, it could be drugs used for adverse events, it could be treatment of adverse events. So all of the costs on one side, although they don't include social care costs, just keep that in mind. And on the other side, you've got all of the effects, which are measured in QALYs. So that's measured in your quality of life and your length of life, and it's measured in a very specific way. And we'll come on to that bit in a minute. So what your economic model does is say, okay, what would all the costs and effects be without this intervention? And then if you put the intervention in, what would the costs and effects be? And what's the difference between the two? And these models are usually written in Excel. They're enormous. And that's what causes that's the core of your NICE submission. So for Project Hercules, what we've normally, each company would create their own model, submit it to NICE, it would be critiqued and adjusted, and they move forward in that way. What we're trying to do here is take a different approach. So we're taking a bottom-up approach, and we've developed a disease level model so that any of the companies who are part of Project Hercules can take that model and then put their drugs results into it and their drug costs into it and use it in that health technology assessment. And we've contracted with a group called Source to do this, and we now have a disease level economic model. So that's an amazing achievement, and it's been really intriguing to see how it's developed. But so this economic model is based on a number of things. So if you go to the next slide, please. So what it's based on is saying like what happens without the treatment, and that is your natural history model. And for those of you who've been in the Duchenne world for a while, you'll know that originally people sort of looked at the natural history in this way. So you'd have early ambulatory, late ambulatory, early non-ambulatory, and late non-ambulatory stages. But this didn't seem to really capture what's important to patients and families, and no one really knew what triggered the move between each of those stages. And how do you really define those stages? What does early non-ambulatory actually mean? Can you walk a little bit? Can you walk 10 steps? Can you stand up? What does that actually mean? So all of these assumptions are too broad, and they're not granular enough. There's also within this natural history model the final stage, which isn't on here, is obviously mortality, and some of the assumptions made about mortality in Duchenne don't seem to be based on any particular data. So there's huge gaps in the evidence base here. So the first thing we did was look at, okay, what do we know? Where can we find the data, and what do we know about Duchenne? So if you go to the next slide, please. So what we did was start to bring together different sources of clinical data. So, and by clinical data, that is, it can be registries, it can be hospital records, it could be the placebo arms of old clinical trials. But what we discovered, it's quite disparate in Duchenne, so we had to go global to get this. And we managed to ultimately find, I think, 11 different sources of high quality data that we could bring together into that space. And we contracted with the University of Leicester. So Professor Keith Abrams is like he is the person to do data analysis and data combination. And him and his team worked really hard in bringing all this data together and started to map out what are the real stages of Duchenne, and how do you transition between them? What triggers that transition? How long do you stay in each stage, and what might stop you from moving from one stage to another? And with our first, when we first looked at this, we then brought patients, parents and clinicians together to see if what we were seeing from the data actually made sense and mapped with their experiences, and kept reviewing, refining and retesting the model. So if we go to the next slide. So this is essentially where we've ended up. So it was very clear that in terms of these ambulatory phases and non-ambulatory phases, there are different aspects to those stages. And companies, when they start to bring their medicines in, need to know if their drug can stop you from moving from one stage to the other, or keeping those stages going for as long as possible. And one of the things that really came out of this is around this loss of ambulation piece, because that's quite often how the trials are marked. But when you're looking at data in the natural history world, you can see that because people are measured at different times, some of these stages could be just completely missed. And one of the things that came out very strongly from talking to patients and parents and clinicians was around that there seems to be another stage that isn't really captured, or hasn't been up to now, which we've defined as a transfer stage. And what we're talking about here is around the ability for a Duchenne person to be able to not necessarily walk, but still be able to have some degree of independence when moving from, from wheelchair to a car, being able to use the bathroom without too much intervention. Because the minute that you stop being able to bear weight is, excuse me, the dog is shouting at the door. Sorry, I've got my assistant getting the dog out of the way. So one of we had a real issue around this transfer stage, because it's really important to patients and it really makes a big difference to costs. So as a parent myself, and having been through this stage, while Dominic could still move from, say, a wheelchair to a car, we didn't need to have a wheelchair adapted van. While he could still move from a wheelchair to the loo, we knew that we didn't have to have a hoisting thing in place. And the minute that he stopped being able to do that was when we had to have the wheelchair adapted van, we had to have the house adapted, we had to have the hoisting in place. All of those things are really important, not just from a quality of life perspective, but also from a cost perspective. So this stage has become a real find in terms of Duchenne, and everybody that we've spoken to, clinicians, patients, parents, all really resonate with this. The other place we've done quite a lot more work is around the non-ambulatory stage, because previously it was sort of lumped into one, you're not walking, but actually there's lots of stages once you've stopped walking that are still really, really important for quality of life and costs. So things like ventilation, whether it's nighttime or full time, but also the use of arms, and how important it is that if you can still use your arms to eat, to make sure that you can feed yourself. So that's hand to mouth function, that's what HTMF stands for. And whether you can still use your hands to operate your wheelchair, etc. So your independence is quite driven by the use of your hands and how much you can still use your arms. So that was really important. So we've integrated all of those aspects into the non-ambulatory stage as well. So next slide, please. So that's the underlying disease progression. So that would be sort of what is happening to patients if they don't have any intervention, or if they're on standard of care, which we at this point we would say would be steroids and physiotherapy. Excuse me. The next aspect of this is the quality of life in Duchenne, and in health technology assessments they measure quality of life in a very specific way, and it's something called utility. And there tends to be a questionnaire called the EQ5D, which is very blunt, which is used. But the reason it is used is because you can then compare between different diseases. We felt that this EQ5D doesn't particularly work very well in DMD, possibly because it's paediatric, possibly because it's progressive, possibly because it's not sensitive enough around mobility. Lots of things meant that it didn't seem to work very well. So this is where we started to work with the University of Sheffield, again, world leaders in quality of life measures. And initially we took on a critique of the existing quality of life metrics to say, are there any that are appropriate? And if they're not, if they are being used, are they of any good and are they of any value? And if they are of value, then they should be the ones that we should use and be recommending companies use. The critique sort of threw up quite a lot of metrics that have been used over the years, but none of them seemed to capture what was important to Duchenne families and Duchenne sufferers. So with that in mind, we've moved forward in developing a bespoke metric for Duchenne called the DMD qual. So go to the next slide, please. It's so what did we do? It's quite a long process to develop a new questionnaire, and Sheffield have done a fantastic job with this and done interviews with patients and their families, making sure we had people in every single stage of the disease. We held patient advisory boards to review those emerging themes about what was really important to patients. And then we had the test survey and revised survey, which some of you may have done, and thank you very much for that. Anybody who has helped us has been, it's just been fantastic to get us to this point. And then we have final questions to sort of ensure that all the domains are covered without any duplication. And but the priority for this is on areas that would usefully inform HTA. And when you see that the questionnaire might seem still a little bit broad, but what it's doing is giving you a utility score that you can then use to calculate your quality adjusted life year. So next slide, please. So at the moment, it's in its final stages of validation. We've got a long version, which is 27 questions, and a short version, which is 14 questions, which we're still trying to probably refine down a little bit further. And it covers the topics most relevant to patients and to HTA, so physical functioning, psychological and social participation. And we have a proxy questionnaire for the younger patients because it might be quite difficult for them to answer. It's quite difficult to create a questionnaire that covers children up to adults in any disease. So the proxy questionnaire is there for those younger patients. Next slide, please. So typical sort of questions are around things like this. So in the past 7 days, I found it hard to use my hands. I found it hard to eat. Some of the other questions are more around social participation, but it tries to cover the whole range of quality of life issues that affect Duchenne. And this questionnaire is now available for the companies to start using and putting into their clinical trials. And we're working to put it into some of the registry data as well. Next slide, please. So the final part of the equation, if you thinking back to our scales, is around the costs and the burden of illness in Duchenne. So what the burden of illness data does is helps to describe that impact and the cost to the NHS and to the families. And there have been various studies over the years. There was a big one in Australia, there was another one in the US. We did an analysis again of everything that had been done so far, and we found that there were sort of major limitations in terms of the scope, quality and availability of those studies. Some of the studies were very detailed, but when actually you get back into it, you couldn't disaggregate it enough to make any use of it. So with this is the sort of final part of our project, is to look at the burden of illness in Duchenne, and we're contracting with HCD Economics, who are highly specialised in burden of illness studies. So next slide, please. So we commissioned at the outset, it's a UK burden of illness study. These studies are really expensive to run because you have to assess so many different impacts. And we started off with a Delphi panel, sort of asking patients, families and clinicians what costs and resource use they experienced. Looked at physician reviews of medical records and did some patient and carer surveys to look at what their burden might be, but also pushing them into each of the different health states so we can assess each health state, how much does that health state cost the individual, how much does it cost the NHS, and then that pushes it all back into the economic model to give you that cost basis. Next slide, please. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what we've done so far, but we're pretty much at the end of our first phase of Hercules, which is developing the economic model, which comprises all of these parts: the natural history model, the costs, and the quality of life measurement. Why have we been so successful? I think one of the key parts of this is the fact that it's patient leadership. Although it is informed patient leadership, because I'm helping to drive it, and I'll call myself a patient because I think our whole family is the patient. But that's really helped, and it's meant that we can access all sorts of data and evidence that may not be able to do from an industry perspective, might be seen as a bit distrustful. Also that we're only asking once, and at the moment, if you've got like 9 or 10 different companies all involved in Duchenne, they're all asking the same people the same questions, and it gets very repetitive. So having the patient leadership means that we can channel that ask and do it in a quality way. It's a bottom-up approach, so we've like taken the rule book and torn it up really and started again, said what really matters to patients and how we're going to build these from scratch. We've taken an international perspective. We've been very close to our US colleagues at PPMD, and also presented at the US ISPOR conference, and helped to represent patients at the ICER review of Duchenne drugs, and ICER is a sort of similar body to NICE based in the US. But we're working very closely also with our European colleagues, and Canada and Australia. I know that we have some of those patient organisations on the line as well, and that's fantastic because Canada, Australia in particular, have very similar systems to the UK. High degree of stakeholder support. I think Josie didn't actually mention it, but you can see on the stakeholders list that we have NICE on there. So NICE are part of our stakeholder and come to the steering committee, and we are constantly checking in with our agencies in terms of whether what we're doing is useful and suitable. And we've kept a really high standard. So we've gone to sort of global leaders in terms of the work that we've done. And we did get a prestigious award, which is the Eurodis Black Pearl Award, and we're really proud of that. And I think I shall pass back to Emily now, because she's going to talk a little bit, maybe a bit more about that, and then also about next steps.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we were very pleased to win the Eurodis Black Pearl Award, and it really was a recognition not just of Duchenne UK, but all of our original industry partners who really did take a sort of leap of faith with us to embark on Project Hercules. It had never been done before, and Josie and Fleur and I used to talk in our presentations about how when we first came up with the idea and started approaching industry partners, we didn't think we'd get more than 2 or 3 signing up, but I think in that first phase we had 9 partners. So, we really are very grateful to them for coming on this journey with us, because I really do hope that it will represent a paradigm shift in the way patients are involved in this final hurdle of drug development. So Hercules isn't stopping here. One of our key focuses going forward is to really promote the adoption and uptake of the outputs of Hercules, trying to integrate the DMG qual into clinical trials, trying to get companies to think early on in their development process about how they can integrate some of these HTA tools, so that when they come to navigating that final hurdle, they have some evidence that they need. So that's going to be a real focus for us. We're also going to try and unpick some thorny issues that have emerged during this journey. Principally the impact of steroids. We're going to try and do a piece of work looking at whether we can quantify that in a meaningful way. We are going to expand the burden of illness, not just to the UK, but to other countries. And something that Fleur and I feel quite passionately about is this, the impact on the quality of life for carers if you have a child with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I remember when I went to our FDA meeting and the panelists were talking about how in Alzheimer's and diseases like that, that the impact of treatments on a carer, i.e. if a treatment can improve the patient, patient's behaviour, it has a big impact on the carer's quality of life, then that's something that should be considered by the regulators. So Fleur and I felt really quite strongly that we want to develop a new tool to assess the quality of life of carers and how our lives could be improved with an interventional treatment that could make a difference and could prolong the stage of a disease or delay our children going into the next stage or our adults going to the next stage of the disease. So we're going to be doing some work on that. And we're also going to be translating the DMG qual so that it can be used globally. And I suppose I just wanted to finish with a final thought about why Hercules, I feel, as a patient is so meaningful. You know, I read this awful article by this father whose son was cycling down a hill and he was killed by an oncoming lorry. And I couldn't get this story out of my mind because it was so horrendous, but also because it resonated with me in a small way. And that, you know, with Duchenne, we're given a diagnosis, we're given a prognosis, and it's a kind of downhill, terrifying journey. We're trying to put the brakes on, but we can't. And we've been told what's going to happen to our sons and what the outcome is, and it's terrifying. And in this article, the man talked about grief and how do you build a life up around that grief. Well, the grief never goes away. It's like a boulder that's been thrown into the middle of your garden. But bit by bit, the trees grow around it and they grow, the roots take root, but they grow around the boulder. The boulder's always there. And I feel like that, you know, as a caregiver, as a parent in this disease, that's what life is like. The boulder is there, but somehow you build a life around it. Now, there's a level of acceptance with that boulder, but my worry has always been that by accepting it, because we have to get on with our lives, we somehow diminish the impact of Duchenne. You know, we say, oh, you know, it'll be all right, or, oh, you know, this has happened, but, you know, and that's okay for us to do that. But when it comes to arguing for the necessity of these treatments and arguing for the real impact that they will have on the patients with Duchenne and on the parents, it's really important that we don't diminish those feelings and we don't diminish the experience. And so what I hope that we've done with Hercules is to take our time over it and to go back to the bottom, as Josie and Fleur said, to ask the patients, what does this disease mean to you? How does it impact you? And then together we can create the evidence that will, we hope, persuade the health technology assessments and the health economists that these treatments offer value to the patients and to us. So that's really our presentation. We're happy to take questions. And as I said in the beginning, thank you to everybody who's filled in questionnaires and who's come to our meetings. You know, this really is about incorporating the patient voice, and we couldn't have done Hercules without you. So thank you so much. Oh, we just had a lovely quote from Philippa Farron saying, thank you so much to Fleur. The expertise as a mum and her professional life has given a massive insight to this project. And I'm so proud of the Duchenne UK community, and I hope that these outputs get taken up. Thank you very much for that, Philippa. I've got a question from Silvano Berioli. Do you not think, and I'll ask Josie and Fleur to comment on this as well, and maybe I'll go back to the natural history slide. Do you not think that it's important in the context of the burden of illness to also investigate the patient's respiratory problems? Josie or Fleur, who wants to go with that first? And I might go back to the natural history model just to highlight the work we did on respiratory function that was included in that.
Shall I start, Emily?
Yes.
I think Fleur's had a technical challenge. Yeah, absolutely, Silvano, and the burden of illness study that we're just in the process of completing does look at the respiratory issues. It absolutely does. The study results, we've just closed data collection, and we should have results at the end of the month, which is fantastic. But we're making sure that we've got representation from each of the stages in this natural history model. So all of the non-ambulatory stages as well as the earlier stages is absolutely about counteracting perhaps some of there's quite a lot of research in the earlier stage and around ambulation and the loss of ambulation, and we're wanting to make sure that we balance that out. And we've actually got quite a high proportion of older patients represented in that study. So we have everything covered, but we've got quite a lot. So we will have some really rich data on that.
Thanks, Josie. Savannah's just said thank you for answering that. Question from Dada Visconti. Hi, Dada. Lovely to have you on the webinar. Thank you for your kind words, saying that this is amazing work. She's asking, are researchers going to be able to access the results and the outputs from Hercules?
So that's an easy yes. Obviously, all researchers are not equal in terms of the access they will get, but anyone representing university, patient organisation will absolutely have free access to these things after they're published. We will also have the opportunity for companies who maybe did not participate in Hercules at the beginning to join that, but we would ask for them to pay a contribution towards the costs of the project in order to access those. But the whole aim of Hercules, and I don't want to put words in Emily and Fleur's mouths, but the whole aim was to make sure that these are accessible, and these are usable, and they are used. Because if they're not used widely by researchers, then they don't have as much value.
Okay. We've got a question from Hayley, who works at Source, just to say thank you to everybody in the community for your time and dedication to complete the questionnaires and attend the focus groups, which has been invaluable. And I suppose I just wanted to ask Josie and Fleur, because you know, if you were an individual company trying to get this evidence together for NICE, we would presumably find ourselves in a situation where each company needs to do the same amount of work, so you inevitably might get lots of repetition. Patients would be inundated with questionnaires. I mean, is that what would have happened if we hadn't set up Project Hercules?
Almost certainly, I think, Emily. And it does happen when you've got a small number of patients and quite a healthy number of companies working in that area, that ultimately all these companies have to answer the same questions. They have to ask the patients and indeed the clinicians, but it's a very small pool. So I happen to be on a board of another patient organisation outside Duchenne, regularly being contacted by multiple people wanting to know almost exactly the same thing. So a real strength of Project Hercules is to be able to do that once, and to really everyone, thank you on the line who's listening and who has participated in a survey or an advisory board, because we've really been able to use your input for all of the work streams and not had to come back to you with very similar questions for each individual work stream, which again is something that companies would often do. So we're really making the most of everything you've given us. Thank you.
And I think that's also why we wanted to do this webinar, to really give feedback to the community, because often we're asked to do things and we don't hear what the result was of those projects, but we really wanted to share with you just how important your contributions were to making Project Hercules such a success. I just wanted to ask Fleur a question, because I sort of glossed over that at the beginning, Fleur. But I suppose what made you first think that we needed Project Hercules? You know, what was frustrating to you, and you know, what first gave you the idea, the spark, if you like, that maybe we could do things differently?
I think, can you hear me? I've had to go off PC and onto the iPad.
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay, I think probably largely because my career has been in large blue chip pharmaceutical companies, and watching a small biotech struggle with trying to get what they needed through for NICE was what really triggered it. And I think it was also just thinking, actually, they're doing this piece of work, and then someone else is going to do the same piece of work. It's going to cost everybody like the same amount over and over again, and you might end up with results which are either duplicative or worse, that say opposite things. So I think it was around just thinking these companies really need some help. We're really appreciative of the smaller biotechs getting involved and like looking for treatments in Duchenne, but they don't have the experience of health technology assessment and that end of things that the bigger companies do. So it sort of came from a desire to sort of help the smaller companies, because we need all of them. We need the smaller companies who can bring these drugs to market very nimbly, and we need the bigger companies who've got the muscle, if you will, to be able to do large clinical trials and drive them through. So it just felt like that it was time for the pharma industry to sort of come together and help the smaller companies, but also support the larger companies.
Well, thank goodness you came up with the idea. So Savannah has another question. I'm not quite sure, how did you organise about data ownership? Do you want to have a go at that, Josie, answering that?
Oh dear, yeah, most of my grey hairs are because of data ownership. Challenging, Savannah. One of the things that we did not want to do, certainly with the clinical data, is create Duchenne UK as the holder and the owner of lots of data. There are so many rules and regulations around that, and it would have been an enormous task. So actually, for example, around the natural history, all that clinical data, we have partnered with other people, in particular CPATH in the US, an organisation in the US that's been very supported by PPMD. And we do not therefore own that data. In terms of some of the outputs from Hercules, then there is some ownership around that with Duchenne UK, sort of shared with the vendors, and that depends on the work stream. But it was definitely challenging to get access to some of the data. It has been a painful process, and there's still some data sources that we would have really liked to include in this initial work that we're hoping to be able to include later this year. So at the moment, some of that natural history data is quite US centric, and what we're hoping to do is to bring more of that UK data in over the course of the year, and other countries to test that and make sure that it's still reflective of the population that we have in this country.
Savannah's also asked, is this a consortium approach?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's a really good example of collaboration, because we couldn't have done this on our own, absolutely not. And CPATH, the organisation in the US who helped provide us with the data, was an initiative set up by PPMD. You know, we really haven't been able to do, we wouldn't have been able to do it without our industry partners who helped to fund the work and who engaged very actively in what they wanted from these outputs. You know, we've accessed such incredible academic knowledge and expertise through the vendors, and yeah, I think the collaboration of the community as well, having patients really share with us their experiences of the disease. So I think it truly is a collaboration. I think that's all the more special, because you know, this is a very competitive world. It's a risk-averse world, and it's a competitive world. And I think the fact that we, you know, the companies, as I said, took the leap of faith with us was extraordinary. And you know, I really hope that learnings can be taken from this for other rare diseases, because you know, the challenges that, you know, those diseases face are similar to us. You know, small companies who don't have huge budgets to attack HTA challenges, you know, small patient populations, difficulty of gathering evidence. So you know, the feedback that we've had both from regulators in Europe and NICE, who are on our steering group, really is encouraging, and we've tried to make sure every step of the way that these outputs will be validated, they will be used, and they are of a gold standard, because that's really, at the end of the day, what our community and what our children deserve, is gold standard evidence to get access to treatment.
I think if I can just add to that, the other piece to be clear about is that this is all disease level. So what we're trying to do is create something that is completely focused on Duchenne. It's not about each specific treatment, and we do not see individual companies' data. This is all disease level, so that's why it works on a collaborative level, because we're not seeing that there's no competition there. Every meeting starts with a declaration that we can't have any competitive conversations, and so yes, so it's all disease focused and patient led. And that's what the secret is, I think, behind the collaboration working so well.
Okay, well, there are no more questions. So I'd like to thank Josie and Fleur for so eloquently describing what can sometimes be quite an opaque area, but also to thank all of you listening and to thank all the patients who contributed to Project Hercules. This is your work just as much as it is ours. We will be continuing its work throughout 2020, despite the challenges we all face in these unprecedented times. And we hope, above and beyond, that we have persuaded you tonight or encouraged you to believe that your contributions have been really valuable and created a body of work that will ensure and will help us get access to treatments in as timely a manner as possible. If you'd like to learn more, then do please visit the Project Hercules website or the Duchenne UK website. But that's it from us. Thank you very much indeed for joining.